Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy news for conservatives to close out the week. And Jim, our good news is actually the denunciation of a Republican. The Republican, though, is Iowa Republican Congressman Steve King, who votes quite conservatively on many different things, but his positions and really his statement when it comes to various immigration issues and some people he associates with has become more and more troublesome in recent years. And yesterday it really blew up when he was interviewed by the New York Times, and he was talking about how he approaches the issue of immigration. And I want to put it in context. So it says, Mr. King in the interview said he was not a racist. He pointed to his Twitter timeline showing him greeting Iowans of all races and religions in his Washington office. The same office once displayed a Confederate flag on his desk. At the same time, he said he supports immigrants who enter the country legally and fully assimilate because what matters more than race is the culture of America based on values brought to the United States by whites from Europe. That's how the New York Times put it. And then the quote is, quote, white nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization. How did that language become offensive, Mr. King said. Why did I sit in classes teaching me about the merits of our history and our civilization, unquote. After this article was published Thursday, Mr. King issued a public statement calling himself a nationalist and defending his support of Western civilization's values, and said he was not an advocate for white nationalism and white supremacy. Quote, I want to make one thing abundantly clear. I reject those labels and the evil ideology they define. Although the Times points out that he has endorsed a mayoral candidate last year that had some neo-Nazi ties, and even follow someone on Twitter who proposed hanging a portrait of Hitler in various places of prominence. So the reaction, though, from Republicans in the House was swift and quite clear. Liz Cheney of Wyoming, Dick Cheney's daughter, obviously, now the House Conference chairwoman. These comments are abhorrent and racist and should have no place in our national discourse. Justin Amash, this is an embrace of racism and it has no place in Congress or anywhere. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, everything about white supremacy and white nationalism goes against who we are as a nation. Steve's language is reckless, wrong, and has no place in our society. The Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal. That is a fact. It is self-evident. Jim, defending Western civilization is a fine and noble endeavor, but when you start tying it to the race of the people that promoted it, that's when you run into real problems, because that's one of the reasons why those on the left want to dismantle Western civilization. Western civilization isn't great because the people who advanced it were white. It's because the principles behind it are the greatest foundation for a society the world's ever seen.
Yeah, it's really well said, Greg. And I would point out, look, there are a lot of times we've seen the New York Times take something out of context, or somebody gets kind of tongue-tied and those things come out the wrong way. This really doesn't appear to be one of those situations, because it just sounds asinine to ask white supremacy. When did this get controversial? Yes, it's always, if you really love and want to defend Western civilization and the traditions we have been handed down, and our values and the principles and everything that made us what we are, you got to keep it as far away from white supremacy and white nationalism as possible. And and King is in that very quote doesn't do that. And you could say, oh, if this is a one-time, by the way, it's worth noting, the Cheney, McCarthy, all these folks you list there, these are presumably people who work with him every day. These are people who know Steve King well. He's been in Congress for a really long time. It's not like he just showed up and all of a sudden he says this, and these folks are, if they're coming out and denouncing him, chances are he's probably done something to irk them somewhere along the line. And this is not his first offense. And I was kind of surprised. I went back and I found this. I'm probably going to put this up in the corner shortly. Back during 2016 campaign, he's on a panel discussion and with Chris Hayes of MSNBC and I believe Charles Fierce of Esquire. And he says, this whole old white people business does get a little tired, Charlie. I'd ask you to go back through history and figure out where are these contributions that have been made by these other categories of people that you're talking about. Where did any other subgroup of people contribute more to civilization? Now, this was about a one-day controversy, and then everybody kind of moved on. But again, you're talking about blurring the line between white culture, European culture, and all that stuff. But when did anybody else contribute anything to civilization? Greg, did you ever play the game Civ?
No.
or any variation of it. I would urge listeners, on the one hand, it's really fun. On the other hand, it's the kind of game that, back when I was in Turkey, I was really into this. You'd start playing it at 7 p.m. and you look up and it's 3 a.m. in the morning. You can really get it because you're starting with this primitive tribe, and you form your first city-state, and you have to go through all the different stages of human civilization to make your civilization the best, and you can play all the different ones. But like from it, it's actually kind of a long time. It's actually you're playing a video game of world history. And you all of a sudden you realize you can't do anything until you have the development of agriculture, which happened in Mesopotamia in 10,000 BC. Domestication of animals happened around the same time. Domestication of horses happened in Kazakhstan in 3,500 BC. Great. This is all really important stuff, right? I put that right up there with all the great contributions of Western civilization, because if you don't have agriculture and domestication of animals and domestication of horses, we were riding horses up until the 1900s, City-states, Bronze Age Samaria, ancient Egypt, Indus Valley. Look, study ancient history. Okay? Lots of important stuff happened before Western civilization came along. And even, Western civilization, depending on when you want to measure it, a lot of people would say you're getting to about Crete around 2700 BC. I mean, by that point, the Indus Valley's got dentistry, wastewater channels, systems of uniform weights and measures, China introducing the gunpowder, the compass, printing press, paper. Think about where the world would be if someone had not invented paper, right? Now, look, you and I love Western civilization. If somebody said to you, what is the best civilization? You'd probably say, okay, this is the one that's probably done the most. But this doesn't mean you pee on all the other ones. Doesn't mean you say, poo-poo, oh, nobody else does anything important or is as good as us. We are built upon what came before us. And we were strengthened by our interactions with all of these other cultures. Oh, by the way, you're probably, you and I are sitting in our computers with our operating on liquid crystal displays and flash memory. Digital cameras are built in, running on lithium-ion batteries, all invented and developed in Japan. It's not like Western civilization is the only thing that can do all this good stuff. So it's like just deeply frustrating that King runs around, says all these things. National Review's editorial board has already offered a very critical editorial about this. Look, Steve King says he wants to help, but he keeps not helping. And if he wants to remain part of the House Republican caucus, if he wants to remain being an important voice in the House Republican caucus and not some nut job quack, he's got to be more careful about this sort of thing. And when you keep making the same errors over and over again, people start thinking it's not a mistake. You actually believe this stuff, and then you're really part of the problem.
All right, let's move on to our bad martini now, Jim. And there doesn't appear to be a lot of progress on ending the partial government shutdown or getting funding in place for a wall in critical areas along our southern border. So the president says, as of yesterday, he's very, very close to ordering a national emergency, which would essentially mandate that it be done outside of congressional authorization, which is one of the ways that the founders really wanted this to work out. So in addition to the fact that it's going against the way the Constitution prescribes these things, a lot of folks have been smart out there saying, look, if a Republican president decides that something is a national emergency and goes around Congress because one of the houses happens to be controlled by the other party, and by the way, he couldn't get it through even when his party controlled both houses, what happens when you have a Democratic president who decides something is a national emergency that you really don't want him to do, whether it's guns or something else? So National Review's been good on this in the last few days as well. Obviously, a lot of people want to see a resolution to this. They want to see people back to work. They also want to see border security, and so they're not sure how to solve the stalemate. But there are some major pitfalls if you go the route of the national emergency.
There are, I'd say, three major problems. And you address probably the first and single most important one. This does not strike me as constitutional, and I suspect lots of other folks won't see it that way. If you want to spend money out, first of all, is this an emergency? Can you argue that the situation on the border is bad? Sure. If you declare that this is an emergency that requires us to ignore the will of Congress, ignore the fact that Congress has not authorized this spending and has not appropriated this spending, go back and check your Constitution. All the funding comes from the legislative branch. The government can't. The executive branch can't do this. Now, in a situation of nuclear war, in a situation of 9/11, in a situation of a giant blackout or something like that, Can the president take action without the authorization of Congress? Sure, but that's what the whole thing about the emergency is, right? The idea that the rest of government cannot respond to whatever that situation is because of these circumstances of that emergency. This is not that case. We're not missing half of Congress. They haven't all been abducted by aliens. This is not, they're there. They just haven't done it. And by the way, I think it's fair to point out that Republicans had control of the House up until for 2 years under Trump's presidency. They really did have an opportunity to do this sort of thing, and they should have done this sort of thing. Yes, we can argue about the Democratic filibuster and stuff like that, but the emergency provisions in there are not meant to be, I can't get my way through legislation, so I'm going to do this by executive order. Yes, this is what Obama did in some argument with the DACA kids, and we had that, we litigated that sort of thing. You may recall, by the way, the court said that Republicans in Congress had the authorization to sue, challenge it in court, file an injunction preventing it from going forward. That's probably what's going to happen in this. The other thing, which is, if we really thought the courts were going to come out and say, no, that's fine. Go ahead, Mr. President. This looks like a real emergency to us. You can go forward with it. You could at least make the argument of, okay, this is probably going to work. We're going to end up with border security. And then the spending fight argument will be moot. But we're not going to get that. We all know that there's going to be an injunction real fast, right? We all know if you can find, there's going to be some Hawaiian judge or something like that. And it's going to be tied up in the court, possibly if Trump gets reelected for even the next 6 years. This sets up a giant fight going all the way up to the Supreme Court, and probably not on the strongest ground for the president. And the other thing, the only silver lining to this would be maybe this would create a bipartisan agreement to say, okay, we got to take away some of these emergency powers from the president. It was never an issue because it had never been used like this. Now we got to take this away. The other, which I think a lot of Republicans are not, focusing on nearly enough. So one of the ideas being tossed around, Greg, is to use funding from the Army Corps of Engineers and disaster response to places like California and the wildfires, Texas in the response to the hurricane last year, Puerto Rico. And by the way, response to the hurricane that hit the Florida Panhandle about 2 months ago, Greg. Hey, Greg, what state in the southeast corner of the country would be really important to Trump's reelection bid?
That would be the one.
And you think if you said, hey, Florida Panhandle, I'm taking the money that was supposed to go to help rebuild you. By the way, go back and read the Florida Panhandle newspapers. They are not all fixed up. This is not, like the disaster ended, but now they're in recovery. Cotton crop got wiped out. Oyster industry got wiped out. Timber industry got wiped out. Guys are describing it. It says that, some of these communities still look like landfills with all the piles of wreckage they have. They're not fixed yet. The moment the president goes out and says, I am taking away federal funding from Florida to build the border in the southwest border, will that help him in some places? Sure. My suspicion is this will hurt him in Florida. And also, I just think it's flat out, it's not fair to the people of the Florida Panhandle who have been promised that funding by the federal government. Congress appropriated that money to help them with disaster recovery, and then say, you know what? We're going to use it to build a border wall. I just don't think that's going to sell very well. Gives the Democrats a very easy to hit the president with, and they will do so in 2020. I think you can safely count on that. So other than the fact that it violates the Constitution, it's probably not going to build the wall anyway because it'll get tied up in lawsuits, and it's political suicide in Florida. Other than that, though, Greg, it's a great idea.
Oh, see, he's going to hear the last part of that, and that's what's going to matter. All right, let's move to our crazy martini now, Jim. And as we were preparing for today's podcast, I suggested a twofer for this, and now I understand why we're going with the one, because there was the San Diego affiliate that says that CNN contacted them about having one of their local reporters come on and talk about whether or not the border wall that's been constructed in the San Diego area has actually been effective. And when the local affiliate told them, yes, we're going to provide someone for you, and they're going to tell you that the wall's actually been a really good thing. And then all of a sudden they say CNN wasn't all that interested anymore, and you think, CNN's biased. CNN just didn't want that perspective on the air. Well, apparently CNN had their own guy that they wanted to send down there and tell you that the wall worked really, really well. They sent him to McAllen, Texas, though. He's White House correspondent Jim Acosta, who, of course, tells us on the air that the wall would not make a big difference and that there's not a crisis on the border. But here's what he had to say in advance of the president's trip to Texas yesterday.
And here are some of the steel slats that the president's been talking about right here. As you can see, yes, you can see through these slats to the other side of the U.S.-Mexico border. But as we're walking along here, we're not seeing any kind of imminent danger. There are no migrants trying to rush toward this fence here in the McAllen, Texas area. As a matter of fact, there are some other businesses behind me along this highway. There's a gas station, Burger King, and so on. But no sign of the national emergency that the president has been talking about. As a matter of fact, it's pretty tranquil down here.
Jim Acosta, big fan of the wall, Jim. Who would have thought?
Look, here I am by a wall, nothing bad is happening, is not an effective argument against the wall. But the second thing I was just thinking about as you watch this, Greg, I want you to think back. I don't know if you ever saw the 1994 classic Speechless starring Michael Keaton and Gina Davis in a romantic comedy about two rival campaign operatives who end up falling in love, clearly inspired by Madeline and Carville. I also like to think of it as an important prequel to the DC Comics movie Batman versus Superman because it featured Michael Keaton and Christopher Reeve competing for the same woman. So this was Batman versus Superman, the prequel, really. But so Christopher Reeve plays this airheaded network correspondent who's kind of a raving egomaniac. And I was thinking about how often you see the portrayals of reporters and journalists, particularly television reporters and journalists, as being these raging egomaniacs who speak with great authority from a teleprompter about things that they don't really know that much about. The joke about it is they parachute in, so to speak. Now, I say this as a guy who writes for a living, does reporting, goes to certain places, and you don't always have the time to be on the ground reporting on something at great length and in great detail. Sometimes you do have to quote unquote parachute in, get your measure. Things like the conventions, right? They only go on for a couple of days, so it's not like you're gathering information as quickly as you possibly can. Having said that, Jim Acosta has turned himself into that goofy stereotype, almost cliched character of a guy who shows up and I managed to find one place in an urban location in the middle of the day on the U.S. side of the border, and I see no problems. Clearly, the border is secure, America. I mean, it's a parody of taking one particular set of circumstances and extrapolating all from it. Now, by the way, there are other reporters, including somebody we like to make fun of a lot, Chris Cuomo, who has gone with Border Patrol, done kind of the ride-alongs type stories, and done better and more detailed reports, including by talking to the Customs and Border Patrol. They talk about the difference between patrolling an area that's got a wall or steel slats or the fence or whatever we're calling it these days, and promoting areas that don't. And lo and behold, it's a lot easier, right? And the argument that I keep, beating the drum on, because I hope someday it's going to permeate through to the general public, you don't need the Great Wall of China from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. You need something like this, which, again, can you find a 19-foot ladder to get over an 18-foot steel slat barrier? Sure, you can. Not a lot of 19-foot ladders out there, but people are going to find it. But that means that means the people trying to cross have to go and get one. They have to go out and get to a place where there's nobody around. They have to wait till nobody's around, all that kind of stuff. If you have an area that doesn't have a fence, people are going to head towards it. And the Customs and Border Patrol wants people to go out and say, all right, we want that. We want to have parts that, a couple hundred more miles of fencing. And then we want people to go towards those open spaces because that's where we can patrol. And that's what makes it much easier for them to catch. It's a funnel. Some people might even argue that it's a trap, right? It's designed to say, okay, steer them into smaller areas so we can patrol smaller areas. And that will make the border secure because there'll be a much narrow area to catch them in. It's just common sense, simple. It's not overwrought. It's not, and all that kind of stuff. And, when you see reports like that from Acosta, you really come to the conclusion that some journalism these days is not designed to illuminate an issue, but designed to confuse it, because you have to be pretty darn confused to believe that hi, I'm a CNN reporter or the camera crew walking around an urban area in the middle of the day. Clearly, there is no crime in America. Greg, back to you. Back to you in the studio, which is air conditioned, indicating that there is no global warming going on.
Jim, I never thought of this before, but I think I might know who Jim Acosta's patterning himself after. Who else can you think of who's been an incredibly arrogant reporter who decided to inject himself into immigration politics in order to try and figure out what was going on at Nakatomi Plaza? Dick Thornburg,
right?
Yes, is the original Jim Acosta.
I mean, let's just observe. I did not like Dick Thornburg, the reporter from from both Nakatomi Plaza and, let's not forget, the crisis at Dulles a few years later,
right,
during the extradition of General Esperanza.
That's right.
But let's point out, journalism was not his first profession. He had come to that LA TV station after working for the Environmental Protection Agency in New York City and shutting down the ghost trap that the Ghostbusters were using. So this one man was responsible for more disasters in the 1980s than any other man. Dick Thornburg, and I believe he changed his name from, was it Walter Peck or something like that? So,
yeah.
Never trust people with beards.
And he almost helped the terrorists win at Nakatomi Plaza. Jim, what a way to end the week. Talk to you on Monday. Have a good weekend.
See you Monday, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And be sure to tune in again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.